I'm gonna do it. I'm gonna talk about Batman. Chapter 1: Batman in Broad Context. I feel like anytime you decide to talk about Batman, it comes with this intense level of baggage from his fans. There is such a ravenous desire for Batman to be marked the greatest superhero of all time that any level of criticism, good or bad, honestly, can cause quite a stir from his base. Can superheroes have a base? I mean, a fan base. I guess you could just shorten that to base. I love the idea of Batman running for office. I mean, I guess Bruce Wayne has run for office before. It's like the opening of Arkham City, right? I'm a little mad at myself for adding that last sentence, honestly, but I feel like I have to. It's funny, I'm less worried about citing the theorists I want to talk about than Batman. The truth is, though, he's been around for a long time and he's gone through a lot of incarnations over the years. And despite his ever changing, ever expanding history, there is a distinct canon held dear by the people that love Batman. Like such figures before him, we pick and choose what we love most about Batman, even if it isn't the traits being portrayed by the latest artists, writers, actors, and directors. There does seem to be a common thread, though. My theory is that the number of people that enjoy Batman primarily engage with him outside of comics culture, but I do think that comics engage the stories of all of his tie in media. This is to say that many of our Batman movies and TV shows often pull from famous storylines, but they often change the narrative pieces around to fit with their new format. Many of Batman's most rabid fans probably have more access to his movies and TV shows than a comic book store, though I do think things like Comixology and the like are making that a lot easier for folks, even if Amazon is ruining Comixology as we speak. It's in these reproductions that we can see the overarching themes and events in Batman's life that are most important, or at least most culturally relevant. When it comes to Batman, there's so much media to sift through, it's no wonder that certain plots do have to float to the top. But why are they almost always the same ones? Now, I do think it's important here to note that despite my severe inclination to cite every crumb I can to sate Batman's base, I'm just not going to do that. That would take a long time to hunt down individual issues or earmarking video clips for all of the storylines that I'm referencing in this video, and honestly, I just don't really have the time right now. And B, the nature of this conversation isn't inherently tied to the details of Batman himself, but instead the overarching canon held dear by Batman fans, the ones that are reproduced by artists, writers, actors, and directors all the time. Because no matter how much Batman changes, he really stays the same, and sometimes it's in the most violent manner possible. Even when these comics do take the time to dig into this, allowing Batman to contextualize what's happening in his life or how it's affected his time with his family, what new level of understanding he gets is quickly destroyed after some other life altering event that forces him into his old habits. But it's not really a remission, but simply a reset. There are no alternatives for Batman. My thesis here, that Batman is an example of intergenerational cycles of violence, something that comics have actually tried to tackle before, immediately lather, rinse, repeating my above comment of resetting his status quo. A fact that I think should be understood as a primary focus of his character, specifically by the people that often remove his trauma as a source of his abilities. The thought really sparked when I read an interview with Robert Pattinson and when I saw Tom King's lead up to Selena Kyle and Batman being married. The lead up to the wedding was highly publicized with a lot of attention around how these two iconic characters were finally putting it aside to find happiness in each other. I was actually quite pleased to hear this. Batman often falls into the particular trap where the only way for Batman to exist is through violence. Batman is not allowed to be happy because if Batman is happy, it's likely he'd lose sight of his mission. His mission is violence. Happiness and violence are certainly not opposites, and they can exist simultaneously. I think that's really important to note. But I'd say that happy people are less inclined to enact violence, at least less so than maybe angry people that have never dealt with the guilt and trauma of losing their parents. And that's when I saw it. The spoiler. There was no wedding. It was all a trick. It was Catwoman literally doing what I explained above. The world needs Batman, and Batman is not allowed to be happy. If Batman chooses happiness, the world loses. This is framed as something poetic and concrete. And that says something very interesting to me. The world needs Batman, but it doesn't need Bruce Wayne. Where happiness and violence are not opposites, I would say that Batman and Bruce Wayne are, so much as they occupy the same side of Two Faces coin, if you'll forgive my pun. Like other characters in past, present, and no doubt future media, the shadow self, in this case Batman to Bruce Wayne, is often the epitome of some deeply instilled trauma, and the only way for the self to contain some semblance of stability is to split. We've seen this from Psycho to Silent Hill. By no means is this the first time that Batman has had to deal with a traumatic experience, and I would honestly say this is probably on the lighter end of the traumas he's experienced over the years, but it's just the latest example of a long running character arc. An arc that never really arcs, it's actually just a line, a through line. Batman is a miserable person. Bruce Wayne is miserable because he can't be one or the other, self or shadow, and so what does he do? Well, I'd argue that he cycles violence, and often through his family. Chapter 2: What Makes a Batman? I think most people would start a conversation about Batman by asking, what makes Batman Batman? I'd hazard a guess that most people would say it's his superpower, money. Bruce Wayne is the son of very rich parents that left him the entire Wayne fortune, Wayne estate, and Wayne Enterprises. He also had a built-in caretaker in Alfred Pennyworth, who quickly became a surrogate father figure to the young Bruce Wayne in his efforts to become Batman. True, his money helped greatly in all of this, though. But that's not the whole truth, is it? There's actually been multiple Batmans, and really only one of them has had money. Well, at least to start. One of them is a circus performer, and yeah, sure, Dick Grayson does technically inherit both Batman's cowl and probably a chunk of his estate when Batman is supposedly killed prior to the battle for the cowl. Please note, Dick Grayson's parents die at the hands of a fixer, the wire to their trapeze snapping during a trick, killing them. We actually will talk about Dick Grayson's money later because it does come up in a later story arc. Then there was Azrael, who paraded around as a murderous version of Batman for a time. Azrael is a product of a violent religious sect and takes over the role of Batman after Bruce Wayne is paralyzed in the infamous backbreaking fight with Bane. Azrael is the product of psychological conditioning that leaves him unstable and violent due to severe trauma at the hands of his religious sect. Azrael isn't well known for being particularly rich. Then there was Jason Todd, also had his hand as a murderous version of Batman for a while. Jason Todd is famous for also having dead parents, one killed by Two-Face and his mother dead by an overdose. Oh, wait, no, actually, that's just his origin story. Jason is known for being beaten to within an inch of his life by the Joker and then being blown up, only to come back as the rampaging, murderous anti-hero villain, the Red Hood. Yeah, as an orphan, Jason also wasn't very well known for having money. Let's see, then there's Terry McGinnis, who becomes Batman. Terry's father is ultimately killed, and he later learns that he's actually a clone of Bruce Wayne, or, well, his mother was artificially inseminated with Bruce Wayne's sperm. This causes Terry quite a bit of grief. We also learn that, Terry's dad's sperm was genetically exchanged with Bruce Wayne's sperm or something so that, Amanda Waller could create a new Batman. I can't. The alternate Thomas Wayne from Flashpoint becomes a violent, alcoholic Batman after Bruce is killed in the famous crime alley. Hell, even the newest Batman, Jace Fox, the son of genius inventor and Batman's associate Lucius Fox, killed someone in a car accident, which still haunts him to this day. Over and over again, it's not money that ties most of them together, it's the constant, repeating trauma of violence. It's not unique to Bruce Wayne, and it's certainly not unique to Batman, it's just step one. And regardless of the overarching theme pointed out above, I will be focusing on Bruce Wayne's Batman, and as such, anytime I speak about Batman, assume I am talking about Bruce unless otherwise noted. And with that in mind, let's, continue. Honestly, it's about here that I find it difficult to relate to a lot of Batman's fans out there. Most that I've met usually proclaim a similar understanding of what makes Batman cool. He's rich, he's got powerful gadgets, and he doesn't have superpowers. There's a common axiom: they could be Batman, unlike any of the superpowered superheroes he hangs out with. Yes, but he is a billionaire gymnast with training from a secret organization of worldwide assassins, so bro, you're just as close to being Superman as you are to being Batman. The justification that Batman is an amazing superhero because he doesn't have superpowers despite his money, his training, and his genius level intellect leaves out two very important aspects of what makes Batman Batman: trauma and his family. Now, I think a lot of people have already had the conversation around Batman's trauma, like a lot of people. Hell, sometimes it's even directly addressed in the comics. We have conversations about some of the violence that he enacts. This often happens in two forms, though: what I'll call the sympathetic approach and the mentally ill approach. Okay, the sympathetic approach for this conversation relates Batman's trauma as a force of change. Bruce is not a man that has lost sight of what's important. It has formed his code of ethics. The death of his parents drove him to do something that few people might be able to do in the face of such overwhelming trauma. He learned how to take a stand and put bad people behind bars. He quickly formed a relationship with the top brass of Gotham City to create a symbiotic relationship with the cops. And he does everything he can to clean up the streets of Gotham when he isn't hobnobbing with the likes of Wonder Woman, Superman, Green Lantern, and the Flash. When he is with his super pals, he's saving the world at large, a true paragon of justice. Here, Bruce's trauma is reduced to a single point of contact, a moment that created the genesis for his new persona and regales his heroics. He has overcome something. He has persevered in spite of his trauma. He bested it. Regardless of the fact that it keeps coming back to haunt him in other forms, he's essentially fine, quote unquote. In this argument, I would suggest that fans and creators position Batman's violence as good violence. It's necessary to uphold the integrity of Gotham City and himself. He does not kill, which is bad violence. There's a difference. And that leads us to the mentally ill approach, which relates Batman to his villains that are sent back to Arkham Asylum every time they are captured. This form of the conversation really takes a page out of the runs of Alan Moore, Frank Miller, and Grant Morrison. Especially thanks to Frank Miller's dark and subversive take on Batman leading out of the Bronze Age, other authors began to question whether or not Batman was entirely there. Was his trauma actually just an extension of some kind of psychosis? Is this why he dresses up like a giant bat, a themed character, to go and fight a bunch of villains that all seem obsessed with him, also themed characters? This juxtaposition and subsequent relation between Batman and his villains were initially posited in Moore's and artist Brian Boland's The Killing Joke, where, after all of the insanity of the comic and the horrific violence inflicted on Barbara Gordon, the Joker tells a joke and Batman and the Joker share a laugh together. A truly haunting scene in its own right. The logical and very extreme step forward on this particular touchstone would be from Morrison and artist David McKean's Arkham Asylum, A Serious House on Serious Earth, which has Batman locked in Arkham Asylum with his villains as they try to murder him. Morrison's take on the villains is particularly appalling, increasingly insidious, and above all, masochistic. And McKean's illustrations are disturbing and chaotic. The story implies that Batman is some kind of mythological thing that feeds the evil of Arkham Asylum because he himself is an evil entity that sacrifices the mentally ill to the unhallowed halls of Arkham. We are left to wonder, do villains exist because of Batman? Or does Batman exist because villains like those in Arkham Asylum need someone above the law to deal with them? Perhaps the most troubling realization is it could be both. In this instance, we approach the line between good violence and bad violence in a way where the other approach doesn't approach it at all. Batman fuels an unjust system because he's too disturbed to see past his own violent beginnings. The mentally ill reading does bring with it an interesting factor, as my name implies, that Batman is indeed mentally ill, as is his rogues gallery. It makes people question why Bruce Wayne doesn't do more with his money to fight crime through legislation, helping the homeless, creating coalitions to make sweeping systemic changes, as opposed to simply going out dressed as a giant bat to fight people that are seriously mentally ill. Why good or bad violence at all? Why not attempts at social change? And I'll admit, there are a couple of in-canon references to donor benefits, a hospital specifically for helping and ensuring Gotham citizens have access to affordable healthcare, and some mention of the Wayne Foundation. There are certainly not as many instances of Bruce Wayne doing much to save Gotham as there are of Batman's graces. And, I'd say that's probably because we've come to find Bruce Wayne boring. People are interested in the intrigue that exists between man and facade, but a comic where Bruce Wayne runs for mayor of Gotham and wins and changes the system from the inside out probably doesn't have the same staying power that a man dressed as a giant bat fighting a guy with a freeze ray has. It's the same reason I think people call Superman boring. While both are symbols, Superman seems more focused on presenting an axiom that approaches violence only when necessary, understanding that there is no good or bad violence, there is simply violence. That's changed a lot in recent past, I think, where Batman is very happy to get his hands dirty outright. No matter how boring Bruce Wayne is, I do think a lot of Batman fans would probably say Superman is the most boringest. Now, I do think that you could create a pretty cool Batman show with, Bruce and Lucius combating a greedy COO or something that's like a boardroom drama vis-a-vis secession. That's, a show that's popular, right? Bruce has to, try to explain and cover up all of the, weird goings-on of Batman and his family while explaining to people how he got so many kids. And why they're really disruptive during all of these meetings and why he has to run away all the time. I think it could be really interesting to see that side of everything. But anyway, so I'd just like to say to you that at the base of it all, it's not the money or the gadgets or the athletics that power Batman. It's the irrevocable trauma that comes with great loss and violence. And like Two-Face's coin that I referenced earlier, people do tend to project this in a very polarized way. Regardless of how we position Batman's mission and focus of good violence or bad violence, it's still just violence. Chapter 3. It's about family. We've been talking specifically about Batman for a while now, especially his trauma. So now we get to talk about the other thing that brings him power, which is his family. Very soon after publication, Bob Kane and Bill Finger realized that Batman was, actually kind of boring without someone to talk to, and thus, Robin the Boy Wonder was created. Wanting to have them relate to each other, Robin, or Dick Grayson in this instance, had his family killed in a terrible trapeze accident. We mentioned that somewhere back that ways a little bit. Depending on who you are and who you talk to, Robin is either a great addition to the mythos, providing a bit of extra pathos to Bruce Wayne and his mission, or he is a terrible character that ruins what makes Batman great, the above-rich, gadget-laden, brooding loner. I would like to counter that last sentiment by saying that I have a feeling the thing that Bruce Wayne as maybe a person wants more than anything is a family that doesn't need protecting. A family that can just exist peacefully without Batman. But that's something not afforded to him paradoxically because of Batman. Sure, his parents' deaths don't vanish, but his constant reification of guilt and suffering that comes from suiting up every night doesn't help him work through that either. Assuming Batman isn't chasing a safer future for the sake of his newfound and chosen family is daft to me. To speak on that Robin issue really quickly, I do sit very much in the Robin is pretty damn great camp, mainly because Robin represents something very important. He was the childhood face of a terrible loss, where Batman's loss is represented as a means to propel him into superherodom. We see the difficult transition of a child having to deal with the loss of his parents before becoming the hero that ultimately grows up to be Batman himself. From a storytelling perspective, I'm actually a huge fan of teenage sidekicks, as many of them provide very compelling stories about difficult topics young people deal with while giving them means of escapism and power to face those difficulties. I think a great example of this is Speedy's addiction to heroin and struggling with recovery. It's something that a lot of young people face, and it's something we pretend doesn't happen as much as it does. And sure, back in the day it was ham-fisted and told rather poorly, but it was able to broach a subject that children might not have to ever unpack by themselves. I have a great deal of respect for the writers and artists that brought forward a lot of meaningful conversation through teenage sidekicks. But I digress. Regardless of your feelings about him, Batman and Robin were together for a long time. From 1940 to the early 80s, when Dick Grayson was ultimately shot in Batman 408. Bruce benches Dick permanently, which led to a huge rift in their relationship that lasted for years. This led Dick Grayson to continue forward as Nightwing, vowing not to be Bruce Wayne. An interesting vow. Why? Well, we already know that Dick's parents are killed by a guy named Tony Zuko. A story told some magnitude less than Batman's origin, but still up there when it comes to comic book continuity. What we learn from most of these iterations of the story is that there is an inherent anger that comes from losing his parents in a similar manner to Bruce Wayne. Bruce, adopting Dick, begins to train him, and it's here that I'd like to dig into the first time we see intergenerational cycles of violence beginning. In their paper, Psychological Trauma in the Context of Familial Relationships, Sophie Isabel, Melinda Goodyear, and Kim Foster said that intergenerational trauma antecedents include the incapacity of the initial survivor of trauma, a caregiver, to resolve the trauma, subsequently then affecting the constant interchange between caregiver and child. We often see trauma passed down or exacerbated when a caregiver is unable to process the trauma that they've already endured. This often leads children to engage in behavior that is similar, specifically if that behavior is codified by happening over and over again. In this instance of Bruce Wayne teaching Dick Grayson to become a crime fighter to avenge what he would consider in a healthy way, with good violence, his family's death, Bruce Wayne is passing down his own poor coping methods and reiterating the false idea that his mission is the way through the pain. The disintegration of Dick Grayson's relationship with Bruce Wayne extends from the moment he realizes that he's in danger of becoming the same as Bruce. It isn't uncommon for people to call Bruce a bitter loner. I think I called him something similar to that upstairs, and plenty of his family members do that too. And Dick decides that's not going to be him. Dick becomes known for his witty retorts, big butt, and campy adventures as Nightwing, even donning the Disco Wing outfit before taking on his own city in Bloodhaven, and I love the Disco Wing outfit. While certainly having some intense moments of his own, his stories often relay his bubblier personality, and the overall tone of his comics is different from the gritty takes we usually see over and over in the mainline Batman titles. He even canonically receives billions of dollars in Wayne Tech shares when Alfred Pennyworth dies in later comics continuity, and he invests it back into Bloodhaven to establish a strong social safety net for the citizens. He does something outright and in a huge way that we haven't particularly seen Batman do in the comics. He engages directly in mutual aid, understanding that good violence isn't the only or entire answer. Again, from Isabel et al., we know that traumas develop and are transmitted in the space between people, both purposefully and incidentally, and have particularly profound effects when they involve a dependent infant or child. So remember how I mentioned above that I respect teens' sidekicks because they can help teenagers understand some really difficult lessons or realities. This is an instance where I think Batman comics provide a space to talk about a very real thing that a lot of children face. And it's one of the reasons that reducing Batman to money and gadgets troubles me. Batman's stories are intrinsically tied not only to his trauma, but the trauma of the traumatized children he adopts. It's in this space between people that Isabel and Goodyear and Foster reference that we learn a serious truth about interpersonal relationships and the way that we teach each other through actions. Batman's only way of conceptualizing and materializing actions against the tangible loss of his parents is through the good violence against those that did the bad violence to him. When he establishes a relationship with a young boy with a similar past, a past designed to make it easy to assimilate him, Batman makes true his traumatic patterns by giving them to Dick Grayson. What's interesting is that Dick Grayson finds a way to break this cycle by removing himself from Batman for a while. Let's see more of a conversation around that in the comics, please. And that's what's interesting. Batman doesn't stop. It's how he ends up teaching Jason Todd to handle the death of his parents after a time living on his own in an apartment in the same alley that Bruce's parents were killed in. I can't make this up. Again, the young Jason does ask to become Batman's sidekick, but this time Batman's a little hesitant, still stinging after the loss of his relationship with Dick Grayson. But he eventually relents and agrees to train Jason, and soon Batman is treated with a very harsh reality. Being shot isn't as bad as being brutalized. Killed by the Joker, we learn a particularly dark truth in Cycles of Violence. Jason is taught that if someone is dangerous or bad, whatever that means for the need to inflict violence, good violence in this case, you do something about it. You take action, you stop them. In Pamela C. Alexander's book, Intergenerational Cycles of Trauma and Violence, an Attachment and Family Systems Perspective, she establishes a definition for social learning theory, the idea that children learn to be aggressive through modeling specific behaviors, especially from adults with whom they closely identify, and through reinforcement of those behaviors. In addition to behaviors, social learning theory suggests that children acquire certain attitudes and beliefs that lead them to accept violence as normative and effective for resolving conflict. When it turns out that Batman simply takes the Joker to Arkham Asylum for the death of Jason Todd, the same thing he always does, in and of itself another cycle of violence, the catch and release that usually leads to the deaths of a lot of people. When Jason is resurrected and learns this, he literally loses his mind and becomes the Red Hood, a previous incarnation of the Joker before he became the Joker, to explain to Batman through action, through belief of accepted violence, that you do something to people that are bad, a failure Jason feels is irrefutable. He decides to become a murderer because violence is not carried out in the way he'd come to understand from his training. There is even a couple of panels where in a fight, Batman is mercilessly beating Jason, only for Jason to mention that he'd never seen Batman hit anyone that hard before, not even the Joker. Is this good violence, or is this bad violence? When Bruce and Jason establish a shaky relationship later, in my opinion, the baggage attached to it doesn't feel earned. They seem to reach this space rather quickly with a just don't kill anyone else again, K kind of vibe. And much to Bruce's own development, this relationship is often broken and shakily put back together again. Not a space to learn or grow, but to simply reset for drama. Then comes Tim Drake. He's the first Robin to have a family when he actually meets Batman. But that's soon not the case. His mother being killed and his father put into a coma before dying later. Soon Batman begins the training of his third Robin, and while I love Tim Drake, he is one of my favorite DC characters, I'm going to spare us another round of Robin torture and instead move on to the next one. But an important aside first. I would just like to point out here that Kate Kane, Cassandra Cain, Stephanie Brown, Carrie Kelly, and Barbara Gordon all exist within the Batman family, though their relationships with Batman don't feel as intrinsically tied together as Batman's relationship to Robin. And this is not to discredit these characters in the slightest. They each just have their own incredible mythos and their own trauma to unpack. But oftentimes their relationship to Batman jettisons their stories forward, specifically looking at you, Oracle. They don't often operate in the same manner as Batman and Robin do. They often operate as kind of free agents. Like Barbara is part trained by Bruce, but also trains herself. Kate Kane a similar way. Cassandra Cain was an assassin before taking on the role of the Black Bat, while Stephanie Brown does actually become Robin for a hot second, but she seeks aid from Barbara Gordon and Selena Kyle over Batman. I feel like Batman doesn't pass his intergenerational cycles of violence on them the way that he does the others, and for that reason, and that reason only, they aren't being discussed in detail here. Though I am going to make a note to myself now that discussing the relationship between Barbara and Stephanie could actually make a really interesting companion piece to this one. But anyway, we're back to the other side. Should I also make a note here that it's a man passing violence on to other men? Yeah, that should probably be noted here. We've learned that not only is Batman surrounded by violence, but he also continues cycles of violence. But nothing is perhaps as odd as the creation of a later iteration of Robin, the one that's born from Bruce's rape at the hands of Talia al Ghul. And listen, as someone who's a survivor of rape, this one isn't really that fun to talk about. You will be happy to know that Bruce is only raped once. A sort of thing I actually notice in media where it's trying to be edgy and bad people like rape others to get children for some reason. Always tasteless enough to do it once, but always inseminated on the first try so we don't have to do the deplorable thing again? Thank goodness for that, I guess. But anyway, I guess Damien was technically raised in a lab. Semantics. Bruce Wayne was still like we're not getting into the details here. Either way, Bruce finds out that he has a murderous assassin child born of rape. Talk about the epitome of our stories of cycles of violence coming to a bizarre conclusion. It is through these stories of Bruce Wayne having to teach his child how not to be a killer that we reach the point where the good versus bad violence really comes to a head. You'd think that would have happened somewhere along the way with Jason, but he's just kind of a killer now, and where Bruce failed Jason, he vows not to do the same with Damien. As an aside, there's actually an entire field of study right now that looks at the way that intergenerational cycles of violence and trauma affect us physiologically and psychologically. Researchers now believe that epigenetic mechanics, a process that occurs when the body goes through a traumatizing experience, could result in changes in gene expression. There's a study by Joanne Ryan, Isabel Shadow, Marie-Laure and Celine, and Richard Safrey called Biological Underpinnings of Trauma and Post-Traumatic Stress Disorder, focusing on genetics and epigenetics, aimed to show that not only does an epigenetic response lead to potential gene expression, but it could also mark children of traumatized individuals for increased risk of PTSD and other psychological disorders in the event the child is forced into a similar trauma response. Now, I'm not here trying to say that Bruce Wayne and Damian Wayne are living, breathing humans and that this new research, not even well documented when Damian was first introduced in the late 2000s, affects them in the slightest. But what I am saying is that intergenerational cycles of violence can be ascribed to the body in more ways than one. And stories where we explore cycles of violence tell readers that violence simply creates more violence doesn't actually explain some great universal truth about how the world works. It doesn't even paint a whole picture. It just paints a very specific picture of a loop, a very specific picture for one of the most recognizable characters in the world. The research certainly doesn't suggest that becoming a killer is genetic. But it does bring to light an interesting reading for Damien, that he's not just a product of his own traumatic upbringing, but also genetically predisposed to some level of trauma and trauma response. It's actually through Damien that we really hit home Bruce's moral code in relation to how murder is bad and perpetuates a cycle of violence, completely ignoring that his violent prowling is in and of itself a form of violence as well. I'm proud that we've reached a point in Batman's story where we can understand that the cycle of violence exists, but we still haven't quite reached the point where we can really delve into the difference between this good violence and bad violence. It's also within the same storyline that Damien learns many of Bruce's passwords are the time of death for his parents, and that's really not working through it, Bruce. And can we just, talk about how cool it could have been to have an arc where Batman finally has to sit down and have a real conversation with Jason to find some way to come to terms with the true nature of their past and their relationship so that they can finally learn, how to break the cycle of violence that exists between the two of them so that Bruce Wayne can finally find a sort of ally or person to help him understand the way to also break a cycle of violence between himself and a child that is his total antithesis. Instead, we mostly get an odd couple story where Bruce just refuses to give up on Damien, and shortly after Damien murders someone else, Damien just kind of looks at Bruce and is like, yeah, you know what, you're right, I kind of just need a code of ethics, so I'm just gonna do better now, thanks. And it's just a status quo restored. Batman and Robin are at it again, and I mean, did we get anywhere? What did we learn? Chapter 4. Let us survive together. Listen, I won't pretend to know why people read Batman comics and watch his movies. I don't read and watch for the same reasons that others do. But I do know there's a very loud minority of readers and viewers that have been well known to gatekeep and push people out that want to engage with comics and movies outside of a preconceived understanding of what comics and movies are. I'd say the tides are changing quite a bit. We're experimenting with the visual medium of comics again. People are writing more semi autobiographical works, more independent publishers are showing up. I'd even say that some of the bigger companies are taking some more calculated risks on bigger franchises. Batman has had the same attachment to him for like the last 80 years, though. The same sentiment. A man enveloped in trauma, a man that must hold vengeance closest to his heart. A man that must continue an endless fight because his perseverance is the only thing keeping the scales tipped. He's made plans to kill all of his friends in the event they went rogue. That would be in Justice League Tower of Babel. He keeps secrets from the people he loves, and he's even rejected the people closest to him for his pride, his vision of what justice looks like. He has to be unhappy. And I have to ask why? Why the fuck does Batman have to be unhappy to be Batman? What quality of unhappiness makes Batman a better person? Why is it that Batman is necessary but Bruce Wayne isn't? My initial point for this essay was to explain Batman as a prime example of intergenerational cycles of violence, and the examples are numerous. That wasn't hard. The comics even offhandedly mention cycles of violence. So what do we do with it? I say you take 80 years of trauma, 80 years of hate and unhappiness, 80 years of violence and brooding, and you have a family survive together. And listen, I'm not someone that believes that the only way through pain is to forgive. If a relationship is toxic, sometimes cutting it off is the best option. But how often the Bat family intermingles with each other, the ability to tell a compelling story of a family figuring this out together has thematic and emotional ties to a long story. And maybe some of those relationships never recover, but make a stand for that, damn it. Don't wishy-washy your way through it for needless bullshit drama. I remember in college, at the height of my time on Tumblr, there was a constant running joke that Batman was a bad dad. I'd say that most of the stuff I've listed above could easily point us in that direction. Batman is a bitter, broken man who has taken a lot of children and taught them some really bad habits that he's used to cope. Hell, even in post-crisis continuity, Alfred Pennyworth was planning on leaving the Waynes until a bullied Bruce asks him how to fight back against his bullies. And Alfred teaches him how to fight back with strategy, encouraging Alfred to stay. And the push to explore Alfred's violent past as a British Secret Service member adds an extra generation to the intergenerational trauma we've been discussing. Not exactly the cheeky British butler he's been presented as in many forms of media. We now even have an entire spy action show for him on HBO Max. But what if we start there? Why don't we ask why Batman is a bad dad? Listen, I'm an idealist for sure, but violence is here and it's probably going to be here for a while. But it doesn't stop us from showing ways that families can learn and grow and break cycles of violence where they are able. Dick Grayson did it, so why can't Batman? It starts with the parent, the progenitor of the cycle, the one that was unable to find a way to work through their own trauma. Sophie Isabel, Melinda Goodyear, and Kim Foster teamed up with Trentham Furness to publish Preventing Intergenerational Trauma Transmission, a critical interpretive synthesis. One of its main theories is finding ways to treat trauma before it can be transmitted to a child during their upbringing. But trauma intervention can also provide critical pathways to break down cycles even after an impression has been made. It may not stop the behavior passed on, but it can provide a point where the continued reification or continued pattern of the trauma occurs. One theory suggests creating a narrative of trauma. The research, particularly in the narration of trauma, says that a common clinical feature of familial traumas is the silence that can occur in families surrounding traumatic experiences. Within familial-based trauma work aimed at reducing intergenerational transmission, developing a shared narrative of the trauma may be beneficial to separate the current generation and their experience from that of a previous or future generation. We have the narrative trauma of Batman. We've got 80 years worth of it. We have characters that were crafted with shared trauma in mind to make it easy to integrate those characters into Batman's mythos. What if, instead of using the death of a child's parents as a way to link the kid to their Batman teacher, what if we use that 80 years of context to start a new chapter of what it means to be Batman? There's an old maxim that happiness in storytelling is boring. Drama is created from strife. But I'd say happiness is a different kind of drama. Happiness is work. It's a struggle in and of itself, and the work that comes with finding happiness as a unit, as a cohesive family, now that's rife with storytelling promise. I don't want Bruce Wayne in the rain screaming, "I know I failed them." I don't want some "we're good now, I guess," or Deus Ex Machina to make Damian less of an ass. Or give him superpowers for a while? That was weird. Instead of piling on traumas, why don't we start digging into them? I do think that one of my favorite pieces of Batman media recently has been Batman Wayne Family Adventures on Webtoon, written by CRC Payne and art by Starbite. It's been an absolutely lovely read because of its whimsical take on the family, specifically from their lives as the Waynes, but it doesn't shy away from Bruce being the world's okayest dad, so written on a mug he uses. It also doesn't stop from showing him being jealous when none of his children wear Batman merchandise, each of them choosing their favorite superhero's clothing instead. And then we have Batman stealing the last of Alfred's cookies from his kids too. What I want to know is, how do we get from Catwoman telling Bruce Wayne that the world needs Batman more than him and that he must be unhappy for the world to stay safe, to fighting over Alfred's famous chocolate chip cookies in Batman canon? I can assure you that the pathway to that is not a pretty one. That healing is not easy healing, especially when Poison Ivy and the Riddler force old habits to crop back up. And I am talking about actual remission and relearning and not just a status quo reset. Thank you very much. But I do believe that that's a story worth telling. I honestly believe that's a Batman worth exploring. The one where he's Batman and he's Bruce Wayne. He can be both, and he can be both consistently. I think that's the great truth that Batman can tell us. Not that life is an endless string of unhappiness, but that we are all so many people wrapped into one, and all of us deserve the opportunity to experience what it's like to be all of those things. Turn the tale of endless trauma into a story about difficult, ugly, powerful recovery. I dare you. Chapter 5. But it's a connected universe, that Batman family. This is a tricky one. We have a new Batman movie coming out, something that may or may not have actually pushed this video to the top of my list. With it comes the challenges that exist with few other forms of visual storytelling. Batman is comics and TV shows, movies, video games, and sometimes even novels. Batman is a property that spans a lot of different forms of media, each with its own subset of audiences that needs appealing and catering to. Since the 80s, there's been a major push to see Batman as the true adult, mature superhero. Tim Burton's movies were a far cry from the versions of Batman we'd seen before, and even more so from the Superman movies that came before it. Batman had become a gothic fairy tale, and the comics released at the time painted him as a brutal force that kept Gotham intact. And listen, I get it. I can convince DC Comics to write a new movie about Batman dealing with his trauma. Unfortunately, I don't know that mainstream audiences are ready for that kind of story, but I hold out that they will be one day. I do. And you may say that movies like that already exist, and that's true, but not Batman movies. And the trauma of Batman as a character, I think, is even more appallingly obvious in the movie universe. None of the actors that play him say they're interested in playing Bruce Wayne, but this tortured figure. It's a way for the actors to be as brooding as possible, to chew scenery, to experience a man that's been truly broken. We act like it's a character study, but it's just an action movie that retells how Batman came to be. With the upcoming iteration, we've essentially seen it for the 5th time if you count Batman Forever rehashing Batman's trauma from a different perspective than Batman and Batman Returns. God, and I remember there was this interview with Matt Damon on one of those late night talk shows, and he was talking about how he was helping Ben Affleck prepare to be Batman, and he told him, well, it's not Shakespeare, to make him feel better about it. I mean, neither were Suburbicon and The Great Wall, so like, what the fuck are we getting at here, Matt Damon? I'd say that Batman is closer to Shakespeare than half of the shit you play in, as if the comparison matters. And like, let me be clear, that statement was to roast Matt Damon and not in any way to suggest that Batman is the new Shakespeare, even if there is a lot of drama involved there. But that's what's great about comics now, and TV and video games. As much as I hate to say it, the audiences for these genres of visual storytelling is a little tighter, so explore here. Change the cultural perception of Batman at its source, comics. Bleed into TV and maybe dabble in the next Arkham game because, something's coming after Gotham Knights, which I'm actually like really excited for, by the way, just throwing that out there. We've already seen some of these conversations crop up, but their exploration is shallow at best. I feel like anytime Bruce and Jason make up, there's a situation where like Jason decides he's got to kill someone and he just like essentially looks into the camera and says like Batman's gonna be mad at me, and then Batman's mad, and then there's nothing to unpack there. Their relation just kind of starts over again. Just shock your audience by breaking the formula. Use characters with 80 years of history to show that there are ways to heal from wounds that have been festering. That it isn't the end. There are ways out. Just do it. Just do it. If you do, and it's good, and you do it right, people are going to be tempted to watch it. Chapter 6. The End of the Night. After writing most of this essay, I came across a quote from Robert Pattinson calling Batman a freak. He goes on to say he's got this enormous emotional trauma inside of him. He's built this intricate psychological mechanism to handle it. It's like a really, really, really bad self-therapy, which has ended up with him being Batman at the end as self-help. I found it such a fitting description of what Batman is often portrayed as in his big-budget films. A freak, always tortured and alone. Admittedly, researching this video, I've come to find that in the comics realm, there's been a lot of progress in understanding what really makes Batman Batman, at least for me and how I've tried to outline it here. I don't think it's enough. It's touching on it. It's got that finger just above where I think the writers and artists should really press down on, but when all of your movies, the piece of Batman media that most people will see, promote this idea that he's a freak or reduces Batman down to a symbol that just beats the shit out of people for 2.5 hours, I can't help but feel like we lose some of what Batman could be, what he's becoming in the comics, a truly complete character. And, maybe that's because in comics we get to spend a little bit more time with Batman than we can in other forms of media. But then again, we see a different kind of Batman represented in things like Batman the Brave and the Bold, certainly a sillier take on Batman the same way as Batman Wayne Family Adventures is. But what we see in this version of Batman is a Batman that's willing to be more than just a leader or a hero, but a mentor and a teacher. And in these movies, especially, we lose a portion of who Batman is because we don't see how he's grown through his adventures with Robin. And let's be real, Batman only existed for 1 year before Robin hit the streets with him. It's not like Batman had a long history of being a loner. I guess what I'm trying to say here in some roundabout way in the above when I said that violence probably isn't going anywhere anytime soon and that Batman is trauma. But Batman is family. Maybe there's a metaphor in there. In literary theory, a very short introduction, Jonathan Culler, the author, says, literature has long been blamed for encouraging the young to see themselves as characters from novels and to seek fulfillment in analogous ways. Literature is said to corrupt through mechanisms of identification. The champions of literary education have hoped, on the contrary, that literature would make us better people through vicarious experiences and the mechanisms of identification. Batman is a cultural phenomenon. He's not going anywhere, and he's a favorite of millions and millions of fans. We've seen the same version of him with mildly different flavors in his most visible spaces, mostly movies and recently in Titans. We've been told that he's not the hero Gotham needs now, or whatever that speech was at the end of Dark Knight. We've seen his actions portrayed through good violence and bad violence, but surely there's another space that Batman can occupy than such a shallow dichotomy. Maybe now more than any, what we need is a hero, dark and brooding, with a broken heart, willing to do the hardest thing in his life. Be honest. Be open. heal with his family. My, what a radical take on Batman that could be.